The point that Peter was just making, that one of the problems that authorities face when dissidents are using tools like Facebook and so on, social networks that people use in all sorts of completely non-political ways, such as to share photos of cute cats, cute dogs and so on, is that if you crack down on the use of those social networks, you're not just affecting a small number of political opponents, you're affecting the huge mass of the population. And that's very different from the situation that dictatorships have been in the past, where if they want to crack down on political dissidents, it's often been, say, a very specific set of clubs or meeting places or publications they can crack down on that didn't affect the wider population. And hence, Ethan Zuckerman sort of coined this phrase, the cute cat theory of censorship, that governments run into trouble when the tools they're having to crack down on are ones that the broad public uses. And we see this, in the Middle East, where certainly the Iranian government, for example, has been quite successful at closing down social networks, but it's had to crack down on social networks across the board. It's not been able to just isolate its opponents. And it's the big dilemma the Chinese government faces, because for lots of good economic reasons, they want to let in many of these international networks. But on the other hand, the moment they do, it becomes very, very hard to control dissent.
And in Egypt, I think very much the approach by the authorities in trying to deal with the protests when they happened was simply to try to pull the plug on the internet.
Exactly. And even if you know nothing about what protesters are getting up to in your country, if Facebook suddenly stops working, you know that something's up. So it becomes almost a self-defeating attempt to stop news spreading, because the very fact of a news blackout means you know something's happening.
In terms of, we've talked briefly about the London riots, but I want to talk about it a bit more without getting too much into the causes of the riots, because there are different schools of thought of that on that. But just in terms of how they were organised, it's clear that people were using social media tools, as we've said, like Facebook and so on, but also BlackBerry messaging to sort of organise themselves. David Cameron even talked about trying to take down BlackBerry messaging as a potential way to deal with it. Andy Williamson, that really shows that the authorities were obviously quite worried about the impact that these media might be having.
Well, I think they were quite taken aback by what happened. I think a lot of us were. It's not what you expect on a summer's afternoon in East London or South London. So, yes, there was a reaction, and politicians have to react to the public wanting to know what they're going to do about it. But I think to suggest that you're going to cure the problem and stop rioting by closing down a network is naive. As Peter said, you choose the tools that are available to you. BlackBerry did not cause a riot. The BlackBerry messaging was used because that's the tool that young people today choose to use to communicate with each other. In 1989, in the early 90s in Eastern Europe, it was the photocopier that was the killer app, because you could quickly disseminate leaflets and get people to places. Well, now we do it digitally. So it's simply, we're blaming the tools. We're not dealing with the problems.
Jonathan Lee, in terms of the London riots, I mean, would you go along with that view that basically it's the tool that's blamed rather than the cause?
Yeah, particularly with the London riots, a somewhat shameful incident. You can't really directly compare it to any of the other movements, which are more about civil society taking root, whereas here is almost the opposite. It was like, God, what does this country produce that can do all this? And people on different sides of the political spectrum will have different ideas about that. But I do think in this particular example, I don't think Twitter and Facebook or even just text messaging on their own would have led to this massive spread and outbreak of violence, because they're more open networks and people wouldn't share that kind of stuff on them because they'll know that they'll find out, tracked down, and they just wouldn't feel confident when other people they know, their family, are on those networks. So it's the sort of urban youth, if you like, or whatever you want to term the majority of the people who are organising and festering these riots. They were primarily, now that people have analysed it, were using BlackBerry messages. As it's already been said, it's a closed network, it's encrypted, people feel secure. Arguably, well, from what I've heard anyway, using it for criminal activity as well, because they know that it's easily stays away from the information stays away from the authorities.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing social media and their impact on political protest with my guests Jonathan Lee, Mark Pack, Andy Williamson and Peter Lekarev. Peter Lekarev, we spoke a bit before about the cute cat theory as a sort of metaphor for describing how different strategies are taken for trying to deal with protest online. In Russia, what strategy have the authorities been using? Have they been trying to get their own message out there online as well?
Basically, for one, they've launched recently a network called My Putin. They called it a social network for those who support Vladimir Putin. Well, it wasn't really a governmental idea, at least. That's what the founders of the network are saying. And basically, they have, at the moment, they have 32,000 members, most of them young males from Moscow, and now they're organizing flash mobs that are supposedly looking like sporadic activity that supports Vladimir Putin in the upcoming presidential elections. Well, of course, there is no clear indication that this is a governmental project, but the opposition, as part of the blogosphere, suggests that this is just the authorities trying to simulate the sporadic social network activity by doing the same, but in a different political direction. And frankly, this is not working very well. Another idea that the authorities tried to was to organize a rally for Vladimir Putin and for the government for fair elections, but not affiliated with the white ribbon for fair election sentiment. The League of Voters that they're now trying to organize, the oppositionist part that is responsible for these protests, for taking people online and leading them to the streets. Well, basically, the government said, let's do the same, but people who support Vladimir Putin also did not end very well, because it appears that at least there are some allegations that these people who attended the rally were forced to attend there under the fear of termination from their jobs. Basically, the sentiment that is going through the social networks, it's kind of like a hive mind. You cannot really control it. Once it's there, it only spreads and it will die off only on its own, and there is no way to control a feeling.
And indeed, Andy Williamson, there have been cases where actually authorities have used social media as a form of essentially entrapment to lure protesters out.
Well, there's a number of examples of where they've tried to play the game, as it were, and try to trick people. The greatest example is the Sudan, where they created a Facebook page for a demonstration against the government in Khartoum, told everyone to turn up at, 1 p.m. on Sunday, and when everybody did, they arrested them. Now, the trouble with that is it only works once. Well, you'd hope it only works once. And it's a pretty scary thing to think of. But what we have seen, more importantly, is there's a real cat and mouse. There's a real learning going on. When things happened in Egypt, governments elsewhere learnt it. So the strategies that work in, say, Egypt don't work now in Syria, because the Syrian government knows how to respond to them. And what's happening in Syria is very different, and the whole social media landscape is very different. So we see it's a rolling game, if you like, of one side playing catch-up and overtaking, the next then innovating and getting ahead.
We're nearly out of time, but Mark Pack, just looking ahead, I mean, no one likes to make predictions, but in terms of where the uses of the technology is going, I mean, what thoughts do you have on what we might be seeing in future in terms of how it's used to organise protests, how it's used to organise social movements?
As you say, predictions are slightly tricky in this area. I think Russia, though, is absolutely central to this, not only because of the importance of Russia in its own right, but also because in a lot of countries the question of what the international community does in response to unrest is very important. And Russia, with its veto at the UN, sometimes exercised, sometimes not exercised, is an absolutely key player in deciding whether, when protests fueled partly by social media begin to take off, there is international intervention or not. So I think what social media does to change the terms of debate over Russia's foreign policy within Russia is important both for Russians but also for everyone else too.
And Jonathan Lee, I mean, looking forward, are we seeing essentially any kind of emerging trend with these protests that are being organised online that going forward we should be sort of looking at as something significant?
Yeah, absolutely, and not just for across everything. It's how people organise and form groups, not just politics, but business in particular. I work a lot in the startup community in London, and that's basically changing business models. It's all about growing a community of people, not necessarily a hierarchical, bureaucratic corporate structure, and that's kind of what's happening with politics as well.
I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. But my thanks today to my guests, Jonathan Lee, Mark Pack, Dr. Andy Williamson, and Peter Lekarev. You're listening to Scott Craig on The Voice of Russia. Please stay with us.